Hello, my name's Lesley Atherton, and this is my longish short story called Blain Moor. Eva screamed, boot, polish and brush falling onto her old leather hiking boots and bouncing onto the rug. Her scream was long, sharp and uncharacteristic of her, ending abruptly and leading to a second or two of silence. Then her second scream began, equally as piercing as the first. Jerry came running with Amelia close behind. Eva's screaming became increasingly agitated as the other two struggled their way through the rooms and corridors of the small ramshackle inn to find her. Where was she, and why was she screaming? They narrowed her location down to the 4-bedded guest room up on the top floor of the pub. It was perhaps the obvious place for her to be, but Amelia and Jerry had been standing outside waiting for her to emerge for their planned day's walking. And from the car park, her screams seemed to originate from the moorland itself. They hadn't sounded like Eva on the waltzes or Eva being tickled. They'd been somehow tainted and confused by wind, heather, and the ancient inn. Yet it was Eva's unmistakable voice, panting and crying for help in between the yells. When they eventually found Eva, she was slumped on the floor. Thankfully, the screaming had stopped, and the young, exhausted woman simply lay crumpled, head in hands, silently sobbing. Both Jerry and Amelia tried to comfort her as they sought explanations, but she was as confused as them, and was unable to explain what happened or to give reasons behind why she had screamed. Within 10 minutes, their comfort seemed unnecessary. She was herself again, explaining it away as a waking nightmare. It was forgotten, almost. That was the second morning of their stay at the Blain Moor. They'd all decided to take a trip to Lancashire for a walking holiday before they began their first post-degree jobs. Jerry was a year older than the two women, but he, unlike them, had taken a year out before university. Their lives were all moving on at the same pace now, and it was both satisfying and exciting. They had all been extremely fortunate, and they knew it. The first night at the Blain Moor had been uneventful and pleasant. The food was tasty and carefully cooked, and the beer flowed well, being drunk with youthful enthusiasm. The second day was the same, apart from Amelia's unaccountable screaming in the morning. The weather was good, the walks they'd chosen were just the right mix of challenging and enjoyable, and the three of them got on extremely well. Usually within threesomes, the couple had the capacity to freeze the singleton out, but these three weren't like that. Amelia and Jerry were brother and sister, and Eva was both Jerry's partner and Amelia's good friend. It worked, and they were happy times. All was well. All was well, in fact, till they returned to the Blain Moor pub on the evening of their second day. They'd been walking locally, exploring the nearest handful of small, slightly decaying market towns, with the help of buses, taxis, and when this got too much, the grudging hire of a car. Back at the windswept pub's car park, they parked up and walked towards the inn, Jerry with his arms around both young women. They were looking forward to ordering drinks and hot food. Always hungry and interested in the more unusual menu items, especially when it came to food they wouldn't or couldn't produce in their own homes, Eva suggested the lamb hot pot with barley, and the others nodded enthusiastically. Suddenly, Eva pulled away from the protection of her big brother and screamed again, loudly and blankly. It didn't arise as a result of panic or fire, but seemed to be the wail of an automatic siren that had been set by timer. Her face was blank, and she was still, straight, and screaming. Jerry pulled Eva towards him and began his usual big bear hug. The tightest hug ever had been what Eva called it when she was a little girl. Amelia smiled encouragingly at her partner of 3 years. She knew he was a good man, and an instinctive man. She and his sister were lucky to have him. Eva's screaming stopped, and her brother continued the hug, this time asking her as she quietened, "What was that all about, Evie?" Eva couldn't answer. Nobody could. The screaming on both occasions had begun spontaneously and ended in the same way. Perhaps it was this place, or perhaps it was connected with Eva's undoubted anxiety about her exam results. If she hadn't received an upper second, her job offer would have been at risk, and it was the first rung to the career of her dreams. But she had achieved it. There was no reason to be anxious any more. She had always been sensitive, But the screaming was new and very worrying. Amelia had already decided to speak to Jerry. She was also going to email her father that night. Given his psychotherapist practice, perhaps she could share their experiences with him without giving away Eva's identity. Perhaps he could help. It didn't take long for Eva to come round. The screaming had left no residual fear, anxiety, or even any recollection this time. She didn't know she'd screamed, and when she was reminded of it, she didn't know why. That was even more worrying to the others. So, during their evening meal at the pub, both Jerry and Amelia kept a close, though not obviously close, eye on Eva. How odd this was. Eva was usually the strong one, the one to whom everyone else turned in an emergency. "This hot pot is fantastic," said Jerry, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically. "I just love how they've covered it with the crust and put the red cabbage and beetroot on the side, and the stickiness of it is fantastic." Amelia nodded with gusto. Yes, I know what you mean." Lost in their own world for a second or two, they both turned to Eva and noticed once again the blankness on her face. It was almost expected that she might scream again, but Eva defied their expectations and jumped up from her seat, sending her drink clattering on the floor. "So many voices," she whispered, men shouting, babies crying. Jerry, again, managed to envelop her in his special bear hug. Again it worked. She calmed down, and they managed to complete their meal in peace, but it wasn't easy. Unlike the screaming episodes, Eva was disturbed and distracted after what she'd heard. She got up. "I need the toilet," she said. Amelia approached Jerry as soon as Eva had closed the ladies' room door behind her. "I think I should email Dad later. I'm sure he'll know what to do. She might be having a breakdown or something like that. Perhaps all the stress of her exams. And I know she's still grieving for the loss of your mum." Jerry tensed. So was he. Both were grieving deeply, and that was the reason why their Blain Moor trip had been so important to them all. Jerry and Eva needed time away from normality, time to grieve in a neutral place, which held no family memories. And Amelia needed time with them both, having spent much of the last year busy with her own family issues. Jerry agreed that Amelia should send the email, and the sooner the better. She would send it that night as soon as they returned to their room. "Do you want another drink?" asked Jerry, preparing for the day's final visit to the bar. "Please," said Amelia. Same again. "Where's Eva? She's been gone quite a while." Jerry ordered a round of drinks, and Amelia entered the ladies' room. Something didn't feel right, and she knew she needed to check on her friend. After everything she'd been going through, Eva shouldn't be left alone for long. But the room was empty, as were all the cubicles. Eva must have sneaked out unseen, but gone where? They would definitely have seen her if she'd returned to their room, as the only way up was via the door at the bottom of the staircase, and that was positioned practically next to their table. It struck Amelia to look outside for her friend, outside in the relentless darkness. The Blain Moor was a traditional English pub built on the ancient site of a coaching inn on the only moorland road through these parts. And the lack of street or road lights as high up as this was at first a novelty to these three city dwellers, but now, worried and apprehensive about what she might find, Amelia wished there was more than just the twinkle of a few distant cottages for illumination. The heavy pub curtains even shut out all the light from inside too. The Blain Moor usually stood as a beacon for travellers on this remote hillside. Its curtains would be open, and its lights would be beaming into the moorland as the welcoming sight of a popular, though remote, hostelry cheered a great many tired moor travellers. Tonight there was none of that. But as Amelia stepped outside, even in this dark, it was obvious that there was a shape in the car park. Lightly illuminated only by the stars and the moon, the shape was Eva. As Amelia drew a little closer, it became more obvious that Eva was aware of nothing. She probably didn't know how she'd got there. Her face, once again, was blank and empty of expression. "Jerry, Jerry," Amelia called, while running towards her friend. By the time she reached her, Jerry was out too, in time to see the frail girl collapse into Amelia's arms. Eva was cold and wet, pale, and looked seriously ill. It was decided. The three of them would leave in the morning. Eva needed the TLC that only home and rest could provide. I'm dying, oh my God, Eva was delirious, lashing out at Amelia, scratching and hating her, shouting names filled with hurt and anger. It lasted an hour. Amelia left the room and Eva slept. Amelia, sitting outside on the corridor, bruised and cut, decided. I know I should stay, Jerry, but she hates me. I can't sleep, and she won't sleep when I'm near her. It's as if she blames me for something, for everything, and I'm making her worse. I'm going to stay in the town, down in the valley, just for tonight. I saw an okay-looking B&B there yesterday, so I'll take the car and see if they'll have me. I'll come back first thing. We'll probably all be better for it. Sure, it was partly cowardice and partly self-protection, but a big part of Amelia was driven by concern for Eva, who was undoubtedly cracking up. If she couldn't get home, then she needed the undivided attention of her big brother without his girlfriend's interference. Eva needed a doctor, home comforts and some time and space for recovery. Amelia needed rest too, that and safety from her delirious, newly aggressive friend. As Amelia packed her few possessions, the snow began to fall. Gently and unseen, the small flakes fell at first, then the larger, heavier, icier pellets, increasing in intensity. And as the brother and sister sat in their shared room and considered how they'd cope without Amelia, the lonely Amelia made her way to the town. Later, when she'd settled into her temporary, safer and more restful accommodation, with warm bed and complimentary drink of hot chocolate, Amelia's mood brightened. At the same moment, the Blain Moor pub darkened as its entire electricity supply subsided and then died. Relieved to be away from Eva, and exhausted by shock and concern, Amelia finished her drink and closed her eyes. Jerry and Eva were alone and almost asleep. Brother and sister, they'd always been close, but never claustrophobically so. Jerry wished Amelia was still there, breathing heavily and moaning about his sister. He couldn't believe she had left, and was still annoyed. How could she leave just when he needed her the most? For a start, Jerry and Eva had no transport. Jerry and Eva were also running out of money. They didn't have a wealthy father to subsidise their holiday. Jerry and Eva were also ill. He had heard that the fever and side effects of viruses sometimes caused fits and hallucinations, and that was obviously what was happening to Eva. Of course it was. For now, the analysis didn't seem important. Eva's flu seemed to be worsening, and disastrously, Jerry seemed to be coming down with it too. It wasn't the best of holidays, Jerry thought, as Eva sniffed on the opposite bed. "You all right, sis?" he asked, and Eva grunted in reply. They didn't need Amelia as nursemaid or voice of reason. They just needed her as Amelia. Jerry missed her. Eva missed her. Safe in the town, Amelia was asleep. Outside the power-free pub, the snow was falling. Jerry was almost asleep when he realised that he'd forgotten to visit the bathroom before bed, so he switched on the lamp. Or rather, he thought he did, but nothing happened. He tried again, nothing. He looked at the blackness where the room's digital alarm clock should have been. Nothing. Damn it, he hadn't brought a torch. Well, you only needed to when you were camping, not when you were staying in a cosy pub, surely. This was a nice little English pub, with its own lighting and heating. A guest relied on the pub's facilities. So what to do now? He remembered the torch app on his mobile. Briefly illuminated, Jerry went to the toilet, checked on his sister, returned to bed and slept. Downstairs, the pub was cold and dark, and though Jerry and Eva didn't know it yet, there was no backup generator. There were no staff to check with either, no cars in the car park. Private staff quarter doors were left unlocked and open. The siblings had been abandoned, even by Amelia. They were Moorland's very own Hansel and Gretel in the gingerbread public house. Those who lived off-site had left for their own homes and beds hours ago, and it would be hours before they were due to return. Those who usually stayed in the late-night staff quarters and the landlord who lived in the second-floor flat were gone. Jerry and Eva were very much alone. Meanwhile, Eva dreamed. The pub was bright and light, sparkling with hundreds of small lanterns, and the piano in the corner was played by a thin-faced town girl with lank, greasy hair. She played wonderfully, songs of the music hall, and some that Eva remembered from her childhood. She was happy. But despite the happiness, she moved from her seat and upturned the oil lamps and lanterns one by one. Some extinguished, others burnt still. They'd reached the wood floors and soft furnishings soon. One in the corner was melting a nylon walking jacket. And the fire spread as fire does. Flames in snow. It was beautiful, so beautiful. And as Eva woke happily, she realised her dream was only partly a dream. There certainly wasn't a piano in their room, and neither were there any customers eating, drinking, and making merry. There were no oil lamps in the Blain Moor either, apart from the decorative ones hung up by the bar. But looking through the crack in the curtains to the world outside, there was certainly snow. And there was a fire, a big one too. Amelia was suddenly awake. Something, guilt perhaps, had prodded her awake like a hungry cat. All was quiet. She'd slept well till that point and had no idea what had awoken her. Purely out of habit, she looked out of the window towards the pub where her two favourite people were still staying. The Blain Moor was totally ablaze, standing out clearly and brightly against the white and blank snow. Amelia rushed downstairs and banged on the door of the office. Nobody was there. Of course they wouldn't be. It was about 3 a.m. Frantic now, she ran back upstairs and started hammering on the door marked private. A grubby-looking man answered, prepared for an argument. "Up at the Blain Moor," she shouted. "It's on fire. My friends are there, but it's snowing. It looks really deep. In summer. I can't..." Mr. Smith understood. He rushed to his window and woke his wife. She immediately rang 999 while he dressed over his nightclothes. "I'll take you up there in the truck. It's one of the only things that will get us through the snow and up that steep climb. It'll be slow, but we'll get there." Once in the truck, Amelia was understandably impatient. Keep moving, she was mumbling under her breath. Now fully dressed, but without the luxury of snow boots or Wellingtons, she'd taken the wise step of covering her walking boots with tied-on carrier bags. "Mr. Smith," she yelled, as his truck chugged slowly and surely up the slope. "We've got to get there. My friends." The truck was struggling up the steep, unstable and ungritted road and past the Unicorn Arms, owned by John the bus and tram enthusiast, who was 4'7" of sheer bubbling enthusiasm for life and trams. It went slowly past, up further and further and further. They arrived at the Blain Moor, abandoning the truck for the last couple of 100 yards, and the older man and younger woman battled through the snow, he with Wellingtons and she with damp walking boots that only impeded her progress. And in the distance, at the bottom of the hill, they heard the fire engine. No sirens blared, but in the still, cold calm of a remote wintry night, they heard the approach all the same. The Blain Moor was glowing, illuminated from above. As Amelia and Mr. Smith stepped onto the car park, the glow increased in intensity, and their breath froze as it left their mouths. Hot and cold, everything appeared with an icy blue haze, apart from the pub's orange-red glow. A roar and a scream pierced the silence. "Eva!" Amelia ran as Jerry emerged from the pub. His eyes recognised something, but he seemed almost unaware of the fire, the snow and the people around him. Amelia ran to hug him, feeling, even from a distance, his emotional and physical cold. What had happened to him, she wondered, as she dragged him to the safety of a picnic bench and shouted to her driver, "Mr. Smith, my friend's still in there. Eva!" Mr. Smith took a glance and ran inside. For a man in his early 60s, he was quick, as he was driven by compassion and panic. Eva's shape was silhouetted in the window, a young woman wearing baggy pyjamas, standing in the middle of a remote barroom floor. Her arms hung by her sides, and she watched the fire dispassionately as it enveloped her surroundings. Mr. Smith shouted, but there was no reply. Over the fire's roar, only screaming could be heard, but this time the screaming wasn't Eva's. Outside, the snow intensified. Jerry shivered, and Amelia hugged him tightly in a warming bear hug. Meanwhile, Mr. Smith dampened his scarf and tied it round his mouth. He had only one access route to the girl, and took it, crawling along the lounge floor. The screams pierced and twisted his senses, but as he neared her, he looked up and realised that her mouth was closed. Her teeth were chattering, and her expression like nothing he'd ever seen before. Mr. Smith reached out, but her unseeing eyes were misted and continued staring blankly ahead. The screaming continued. Then from behind the bar came a sound of deep growling, the sight of an elongated arm reaching for him, and the swirls of uncontrolled, uncompressed air. Drawn to the sights and sounds, Mr. Smith got up from his position on the floor, and, as unbothered by the smoke and flames as Eva was, he began to walk through. Hesitantly but firmly he was drawn into the flames, until Eva reached out to him, touched him. Then from the snow-covered picnic bench, Amelia and Jerry heard agitated screams from both Eva and Mr. Smith, followed by silence for just a few seconds. Without warning, the lights reappeared inside the building. The weather changed. It was no longer a dark, snowy winter's night. It was emerging as a warm winter's day with neither snow nor darkness. But the glow appeared only around the pub. Everything else was nighttime black. Night became day and foul weather became fair. Eerie quiet became normal industry. Even the animals, the sheep in the fields, the distant barking sheepdogs, were their usual daytime selves. Only the 3 kids had seen it, just 3 kids and Mr. Smith, who watched avidly as his town street lamps relighted one by one. As they did so, the snow melted. Eva was fine, as if nothing had happened, and as if the holiday was what it should have been from the start, a proper restful treat. But Mr. Smith would never be quite the same again. One moment he was in a burning bar-room with a wet cloth round his nose and mouth, reaching out to a terrified girl, and surrounded by encroaching flames. Darkness, smoke, terror, screaming. The next moment all flames were gone. The girl was smiling. He was shivering, cold, scared. The lights came on. The fire brigade turned around and began their descent back into town. This was clearly another hoax call. How could it be otherwise when there were no signs of flame or smoke? By the time the 3 holidaymakers began their descent down the hill, crushed inside Mr. Smith's truck, almost all signs of snow had disappeared. Night had become day. From houses and churches they heard people singing Christmas carols, though it was late summer. They said nothing. As the truck passed by the terraced cottages on the road down the hill, each lit up as if connected to a motion-sensitive pad under the tractor's wheels. One by one, bit by bit, the town was coming to life, enlivening as they passed. They opened the door to the B&B and sat down, holding each other. Mrs. Smith, expectant in her well-stocked kitchen, was prepared for their presence with cups of tea and iced buns, and Mrs. Smith wasn't as dour as she'd first seemed. She had poetry in her soul. "Them barren hillsides," she said, "battered by wind and snow. Lots goes on up there that nobody ever knows of. I heard a story once. Happened up there, it did, not far from the Blain. Oh, there was a lot of screaming. People said after that it was the screaming of a soul with secrets who couldn't hold them in any longer. I think it was the soul of a wronged one, calling out and just hoping someone special might hear her. Oh, the screams there were. You see, it all happened when the murder victim's granddaughter walked past her grand's unknown resting place. They found the poor kid screaming and digging up the lay-by with her bare hands. Ended up in a madhouse, she did, for a few years, and she never properly got over it. It's them kind of things that gets to you." Nobody could refute that. They nodded their heads. "It's light outside now, in the garden." Shouldn't be, said Mr. Smith. Mrs. Smith nodded. "Them hillsides, full of secrets, full of mysteries," she replied. Nobody could disagree. "Full of death and dying," she continued with a shiver. "Do you mind if we stay here for the rest of our holiday?" asked Eva. "I didn't really like it up there." The Smiths both nodded. They were happy enough. Their collective experience would be ignored, but shared silently. So they sat, the 5 of them, drank the tea and ate their buns, and decided to talk no more about it. They discussed Wimbledon and the need for a more consistent cancer care provision in rural communities. Soon afterwards they would all, one by one, make their way to bed.